In 1945, American soldiers marching through Bavaria made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside a luxurious castle near Munich, they found 300 children, all blonde-haired, blue-eyed, aged between 6 months and 6 years old. The children had no parents, no guardians, no identification. They spoke only German, but many weren't German at all. Some had been stolen from their families in Poland. Others were born to mothers who had vanished without a trace. These weren't war orphans. They were the products of the most chilling experiment in human history. For 10 years, while the world watched Hitler's armies march across Europe, Heinrich Himmler had been running secret factories. Not factories for weapons or tanks, but factories for breeding human beings like livestock. Welcome to the story the Nazis never wanted you to discover, the Lebensborn program. It began in 1935, quietly, with a program that the world wouldn't learn about until it was too late. Lebensborn, translated as Fountain of Life, was the brainchild of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of Adolf Hitler's most loyal followers. Himmler had no background in medicine or genetics, but he had a fanatical belief in racial purity. His idea wasn't just to preserve the so-called Aryan race. It was to manufacture it, to breed it into existence through state control. The first Lebensborn home was set up in December 1935 in Steinhorn, Bavaria, a quiet town near Munich where nothing extraordinary had ever happened before. The Nazis deliberately chose this former nursing institution because it looked innocent, a large, welcoming building that wouldn't raise suspicions among the local population. But what they created inside was anything but innocent. The SS spared no expense in outfitting this facility. They furnished it with stolen goods, furniture, artwork, and medical equipment confiscated from Jewish households whose occupants had been sent to Dachau, the first of the Nazi concentration camps. The irony was deliberate and cruel. Items stolen from families being destroyed were used to create a facility designed to manufacture what the Nazis considered the perfect family. The home was designed to look like a luxury retreat for expectant mothers. There were comfortable bedrooms, common areas for socializing, and state-of-the-art medical facilities. But beneath this facade of comfort lay a rigid control structure. Every woman who entered had to pass through multiple checkpoints. First, racial inspectors would verify her Aryan credentials. Then, medical staff would conduct invasive examinations to ensure she met the physical requirements. Finally, SS administrators would review her family history going back generations, searching for any trace of what they deemed undesirable bloodlines. The rules were absolute and non-negotiable. No woman could enter without proving her racial purity back to her great-grandparents. No woman could leave without signing documents renouncing all rights to her children. No woman could communicate with the outside world about what happened inside those walls. The staff were sworn to secrecy, and the entire operation was classified at the highest levels of the SS. By 1939, the success of Steinhorn had convinced Himmler to expand rapidly. More homes opened across Germany, then across occupied territories as Nazi armies conquered Europe. Each facility followed the same blueprint: luxurious accommodations hiding a factory for human production, where women's bodies became tools of the state and children became property of the Reich. The selection process for Lebensborn wasn't rooted in compassion or respect. It was rooted in Nazi racial pseudoscience that reduced human beings to nothing more than breeding stock. Women were treated as tools, judged not by character, intellect, or humanity, but by how well their bodies matched the regime's twisted racial blueprint. In the eyes of the Nazis, the ideal woman was not an individual with dreams, aspirations, or rights. She was simply a vessel for breeding, a means to an end in their quest for racial purity. Before a woman could even be considered for the program, she had to endure an extensive screening process that was designed to strip away every shred of dignity and personal autonomy. SS doctors and racial experts, men with no legitimate scientific credentials but absolute authority over women's bodies, conducted examinations that were invasive, humiliating, and deliberately dehumanizing. These weren't medical checkups in any recognizable sense. They were racial inspections that treated women like livestock at auction. The physical examinations were methodical and degrading. SS officers would use calipers and measuring tools to assess the shape of a woman's nose, determining whether it was Nordic enough for their standards. They measured the width of jaws, the length of limbs, the circumference of heads. Even the distance between the eyes could be a deciding factor. Too close together or too far apart, and a woman would be deemed racially inferior. The curvature of the spine, the width of the hips, the size of the pelvis. Every aspect of a woman's body was scrutinized and judged against an arbitrary standard of Aryan perfection. These women were often forced to undress completely in front of multiple male examiners who would photograph them from various angles, document their measurements, and evaluate their fitness like specimens in a laboratory. The examiners would check for scars, birthmarks, or any physical imperfections that might indicate genetic weakness. They examined hair texture, eye color intensity, and skin tone under bright lights. Some women reported being made to walk, bend, and perform physical tasks while naked, as the examiners assessed their breeding potential and physical stamina. But the humiliation didn't end with the physical examination. The scrutiny extended far beyond appearance into every aspect of a woman's family history. Teams of investigators would comb through generations of family records, church documents, birth certificates, and marriage licenses, searching for any hint of what they deemed non-Aryan ancestry. They looked for Jewish blood, Roma heritage, Slavic connections, or any trace of what the Nazis considered inferior races. The investigation went back at least 3 generations, sometimes 4, requiring women to provide detailed genealogical charts proving their racial purity. Medical records of entire family lines were examined for signs of hereditary diseases, mental illness, or physical disabilities. If any relative, no matter how distant, had suffered from epilepsy, depression, alcoholism, or even nearsightedness, it could lead to immediate disqualification. The Nazis believed these conditions were hereditary and would contaminate their master race. Even rumors of moral weakness in the family could be disqualifying. A cousin who had been arrested, an uncle with gambling problems, a grandmother who had been unmarried when she gave birth. Any of these could result in rejection. The investigators didn't just look at medical and criminal records. They examined employment history, political affiliations, and social connections. Had anyone in the family ever associated with Jews? Had they shown sympathy for communists or socialists? Had they attended the wrong churches or expressed doubts about Nazi ideology? The background checks were so thorough that they often took months to complete, during which time the women lived in uncertainty, not knowing if they would be accepted or rejected. Perhaps most disturbing was the age of many women selected for the program. Some were still teenagers, barely out of childhood themselves, some as young as 16 or 17 years old. The Nazi regime saw this as a calculated investment. The younger the women, the more reproductive years they had ahead of them, and the more children they could potentially produce for the Reich. These girls were often recruited directly from schools, youth organizations, or through family connections to the Nazi Party. Many of these young women entered the program believing they were performing a patriotic duty. Local Nazi Party officials, teachers, and youth leaders would identify girls who fit the physical criteria and approach them with carefully crafted propaganda. They were told they had been chosen for a special honor, that they possessed superior genetic qualities that made them valuable to the future of Germany. The recruitment was often disguised as an opportunity for education, career advancement, or social status. Some girls were told they would receive training in domestic skills, childcare, or nursing that would prepare them for marriage and motherhood. Others were promised financial support, housing, or educational opportunities that their families couldn't afford. The recruiters preyed on economic desperation, family loyalty, and youthful idealism, convincing these girls that participating in Lebensborn was both an honor and a duty. But the reality was far different from the promises. Once accepted into the program, these young women discovered they had signed away their reproductive autonomy. They were required to sign legal documents renouncing all rights to any children they might bear. They were forbidden from forming emotional attachments to their assigned breeding partners. They were told when to eat, when to sleep, when to exercise, and when to engage in sexual activity, all calculated to maximize their fertility and the likelihood of producing racially valuable offspring. While Nazi propaganda claimed that all participation was voluntary, the reality was much darker and more coercive. Many women found themselves trapped in a system where refusal wasn't really an option. Some were pressured into sexual relationships with SS officers under the guise of racial matchmaking, but the power dynamics made genuine consent impossible. These were young, often naive women being manipulated by older men in positions of absolute authority, backed by the full power of the Nazi state. The regime didn't care about emotional bonds, personal preferences, or individual consent. They wanted results: blonde, blue-eyed babies who would grow up to serve the Third Reich. The women were simply the means to achieve that end, their bodies and reproductive capacity viewed as resources to be exploited in service of Nazi racial ideology. Over 20,000 children were born directly inside Lebensborn homes between 1935 and 1945, but that number doesn't fully reflect the program's reach. These children weren't just the result of planned pairings between SS men and racially approved women. They became the living symbols of the Nazis' twisted dream of racial perfection. And from birth, their lives were tightly controlled by the regime. For the children born in the Lebensborn clinics, their identities were shaped from the moment they took their first breath. Many were taken from their biological mothers shortly after birth, especially if the mother was unmarried or considered socially unfit to raise a valuable child. The SS would hand these infants over to families loyal to the Nazi regime, ideally ones with SS fathers, who were expected to raise them under strict ideological and racial standards. Those not adopted right away were sent to specially selected Nazi-run institutions and boarding schools, where they were subjected to a constant stream of racial ideology. Everything they learned was designed to reinforce the idea that they were genetically superior. Playtime, meals, and bedtime routines were all structured around discipline, physical strength, and blind loyalty. But Lebensborn wasn't only about German-born babies. As the Nazis spread their control across Europe, they turned the program into something even darker. In places like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland, thousands of children were forcibly removed from their families because they had the right features. Nazi officers would visit orphanages, hospitals, and even rural homes, searching for children with blonde hair, fair skin, and blue eyes. Poland suffered the most. As soon as German troops invaded Poland in 1939, the Nazi regime began more than just military occupation. They launched a campaign to steal children. Children were often taken by force, torn from their families in the middle of the night, or separated during deportations. Sometimes, whole groups of children were rounded up from orphanages or schools. Parents were told their child had died of illness, only to later discover they had been abducted. One of the central facilities in this process was the camp at Lodz, Poland, which the Nazis renamed Litzmannstadt. Within this city, a special center called Kinderkäse was created. It looked like an ordinary orphanage from the outside, but inside, doctors performed racial assessments, physical exams, and psychological tests. Children who were deemed unfit often faced grim fates. Some were sent to other camps for forced labor. Others simply disappeared. Those who passed the tests were given new German names, taught the German language, and placed into Lebensborn homes or fostered by Nazi-approved families. Many were told their biological parents were dead or had abandoned them. They were then raised to believe they were German from birth. The scale of this operation was massive. Historians estimate that at least 200,000 children were kidnapped from Eastern Europe during the war, with Poland suffering the greatest number of abductions. Other countries targeted included Slovenia, Ukraine, the Czech lands, and parts of the Soviet Union. The process was bureaucratic and organized. Files were kept, transport routes were mapped out, and each child was tagged like inventory. The exterior of Lebensborn homes was designed to look welcoming. Large country houses or villas, often in quiet, picturesque areas. From a distance, they looked like safe places for expecting mothers. But behind the doors, these homes operated with military precision and chilling indifference. Pregnant women admitted to these homes were immediately subjected to strict rules and surveillance. Their daily routines were rigid, scheduled meals, regulated rest times, and mandatory medical checks. Nutrition was controlled carefully, not for the mother's well-being, but to ensure the child's development matched the Nazis' ideal of Aryan perfection. The women had little autonomy and were constantly monitored by nurses and midwives loyal to the SS. Emotional attachment was discouraged. Staff were trained to view the pregnancies as clinical processes rather than maternal experiences. Nurses did not comfort the mothers. Instead, they observed them like test subjects in an experiment. Conversations were limited, and outside contact was restricted. Mothers were often not told what would happen to their babies, only that they would be taken care of by the state. After birth, infants were immediately examined. Their physical features were assessed. Babies deemed racially valuable were documented, tagged, and separated. If a child failed to meet racial expectations due to a deformity, health issue, or even slightly darker features, the consequences could be fatal. Norway wasn't just a side note in the Lebensborn program. It was a central piece of the Nazis' racial blueprint. The Nazi regime saw Scandinavians as some of the closest to the so-called Aryan ideal outside of Germany. Heinrich Himmler believed Norway was the perfect ground for racial expansion. He even wanted to turn the country into a breeding colony for the SS. German soldiers stationed in Norway were openly encouraged to pursue Norwegian women, especially those with light features. The relationships weren't always forced, but they were heavily promoted by Nazi propaganda. In some cases, soldiers promised the women protection or status. In others, the women were manipulated or pressured. At least 9 Lebensborn homes were established across Norway. These facilities offered free medical care and secrecy for the mothers. Some women believed they were helping build a better future for their country, especially during the German occupation. Others didn't know the true purpose of the program until they had already given birth. By the end of the war, roughly 12,000 children had been born under this program in Norway alone. But once the Nazis were defeated, the children and their mothers became targets, not just of public scorn, but of institutional abuse. The Norwegian government, eager to restore its image after years of German occupation, treated the Lebensborn children as a national disgrace. Some were forcibly removed from their mothers and placed in remote orphanages or psychiatric facilities. Inside these institutions, many were subjected to isolation, humiliation, and violence. Worse still, some of the children became the subjects of psychological experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, under classified programs partially supported by foreign governments, a number of Lebensborn children were used in studies without consent. These experiments were framed as scientific research into inherited behavior or mental illness. In truth, they were acts of state-sanctioned cruelty. After Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, Allied forces uncovered the infrastructure and documents behind the Lebensborn program. But even with evidence in hand, unraveling the scale and purpose of the program proved difficult. Lebensborn wasn't like the death camps. It didn't leave behind mass graves or gas chambers. Its crimes were buried in paperwork, secrecy, and silence. The RU-SHA trial commenced on October 20, 1947, focusing on 14 high-ranking officials from the SS Race and Settlement Main Office and the Lebensborn Society. The defendants faced charges of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations, primarily for their involvement in the Nazi racial program, including the kidnapping of children deemed racially valuable for Germanization. However, the court found that of approximately 10,000 foreign-born children located after the war in the American-controlled area of Germany, only 340 had been handled by Lebensborn. The tribunal concluded that the prosecution failed to prove with requisite certainty the participation of Lebensborn and its officials in the kidnapping program. Despite the evidence, most of the defendants received light sentences. The court ruled that Lebensborn itself wasn't a criminal organization. Only certain acts associated with it were. This meant many who had helped run the program walked free. After the war, efforts to locate and return these children were difficult and often unsuccessful. Many had been relocated deep into Germany or Austria. Their records were altered or destroyed. Some children had lived for years believing they were German and rejected the idea of returning to a country or family they couldn't remember. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that serious historical research and survivor testimony began to emerge. Some former Lebensborn children went on personal quests to uncover their origins, traveling across Europe and digging through archives that had been sealed for decades. What they found wasn't always closure. In some cases, entire birth records had been falsified or destroyed. Gunther was one of them. He had always believed he was a regular German citizen, raised in a patriotic household by loving parents who had given him everything he needed for a successful life. For over 50 years, he lived with complete certainty about his identity, his heritage, his place in the world. But when he applied for a passport in his 50s, discrepancies in his paperwork led to a shocking discovery that would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. He wasn't born in Germany. He was Polish. And the people he had called parents his entire life weren't his biological family. The revelation sent Gunther on a desperate quest for answers. Digging through archives, contacting historians, and piecing together fragments of documentation, he uncovered a truth more horrifying than he could have imagined. His real parents had been executed during the Nazi occupation of Poland. He had been stolen from his home as a toddler, tested for racial purity, and Germanized before he could even speak his native language. His entire identity, his name, his nationality, his family history, had been a carefully constructed lie. The loving German parents who raised him had unknowingly participated in one of history's most calculated crimes, believing they were adopting a German war orphan, when in reality, they were raising a kidnapped Polish child whose family had been murdered by the very regime that stole him. Even by the age of only 10 years old, Giselle Mark felt that she was somehow different from other children. At her school in northeastern France, she constantly overheard rumors being spread about her and her family, that her mother and father weren't her real parents. The whispers made her feel ashamed and shunned by children her own age. When she finally worked up the courage to ask her adoptive mother about it, she was told only part of the truth. You spoke German, but now you are French. Her mother refused to say anything more for the rest of her life. It was only when Giselle was searching her parents' room for answers that she found her birth certificate hidden in a drawer. What she discovered was so shocking that she burned the document when she was 18, lighting it on fire at the stove, believing she needed to destroy the evidence to live a normal life. Years later, after building her own family and working in a children's hospital, Giselle finally began investigating her origins. Through the Erolsen archives in Germany, she learned the devastating truth. She hadn't been born in France at all, but near Liège, in Belgium, at the Château de Wegemont, an SS-run maternity home. She was a Lebensborn child, born as part of the Nazis' racial breeding program. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. After spending years defending her own mixed-race children against racism, she had discovered that she herself was born as a result of one of history's most deplorable racial projects. In the end, only a small fraction, around 15%, were ever reunited with their birth families. The Lebensborn program controlled women's bodies and children's lives. And all of it started because a group of men believed that only certain people deserved to exist. This is exactly the kind of untold story that World Warpedia is dedicated to bringing you. While most documentaries focus on the battles and well-known events of World War II, we dig deeper into the hidden chapters, the classified operations, and the human stories that reveal the true scope of this global conflict. If you found this investigation into the Lebensborn program as shocking and important as I did, make sure to subscribe to World War II Media. We're committed to uncovering the untold stories of World War II, the secret operations, the forgotten victims, and the hidden truths that shaped our world. Hit that notification bell, because these are the stories that history classes never taught you, but that you need to know.